Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, imagine this. A girl born without eyes, her sockets sealed over by smooth, pale skin, as though her face had refused to complete itself. She lived in the silence of an old farmhouse, hidden deep in the Appalachian hills, where the neighbors whispered of curses but dared not come too close. Her name was never recorded in the family Bible, as if she had been erased before she even drew her first breath. Yet the town would one day discover something even more unsettling than her blindness. Something they would never put into the newspaper, and that the family tried desperately to bury. Because the girl, this eyeless daughter of a family tangled in its own bloodline, was also pregnant. This is not folklore. This is not a campfire story. What I'm about to tell you comes from fragments of court records, half-burned letters, and interviews that locals swore they'd never allow to be taped. And as you listen, you may begin to feel that same cold weight in your stomach, the one that settles in when you realize you're trespassing into a part of American history that was never meant to be unearthed. The deeper I searched into this family's past, the more it resembled a shadow that stretched across generations, a lineage defined not by growth or prosperity, but by collapse. Brothers marrying cousins, daughters born with deformities, entire branches of the family tree folding back in on itself like a serpent devouring its tail. And in the middle of it all was the eyeless girl, the child who was hidden from sight, until her condition forced the family to face the impossible truth. Their bloodline had created something too disturbing to explain, and too dangerous to let the outside world ever know. Tonight, you and I are going to peel back the layers of that truth. But be warned, once you see what lies underneath, you will never forget it. When people hear about cases of inbreeding in rural America, they imagine caricatures, half-truths turned into grotesque jokes. But what they don't realize is that beneath those jokes are real human beings, families that carried a shame so heavy it bent their spines. And in this family's case, it was a shame born out of secrecy, isolation, and a refusal to let outsiders inside their world. The land they lived on was harsh, unforgiving. Appalachia in the late 1800s was a place where roads ended, where schools were too far to reach, and where bloodlines often had no choice but to circle back on themselves. The men worked the coal seams until their lungs blackened. The women tended the home, bearing child after child, most of whom didn't live past their first year. The graveyard behind the farmhouse told the story more honestly than any of the surviving relatives ever would. Small stones, unmarked or carved only with a single letter. Silent testimonies to children who were never meant to live. It was in this silence that the eyeless daughter was born. Her mother, a cousin to her own husband, gave birth alone on a dirt floor, her screams muffled by a rag stuffed between her teeth. They say the midwife refused to touch the baby. She left the house that night and never returned, telling neighbors later that she had seen something unnatural, something she dared not describe. From then on, the child was kept hidden, her existence denied. Family members claimed she had been born dead. But in truth, she lived, sequestered in a back room with nailed-shut windows, where no curious glance could ever confirm the rumors. What the family did not understand was that secrets rot from the inside out. The more they tried to conceal her, the more the story leaked through the cracks. A cousin's drunken whisper at the tavern, a neighbor catching sight of a figure moving behind the curtain, and at night, a schoolteacher overhearing two children repeat a strange rhyme about the girl with no eyes. The legend of the eyeless daughter spread, but it was only the beginning. Because when the whispers finally reached the sheriff and he arrived at the farmhouse to confirm the truth for himself, he found something even darker than anyone in town had imagined. The sheriff's visit began like any other. A knock at the door, heavy boots on rotting wood. The family patriarch greeted him with a stiff jaw, a man who had worked his whole life in silence and expected the world to return the same. He tried to send the sheriff away, insisting the rumors were children's tales. But lawmen in those days had a sense for lies. They could smell fear in a room. And when the sheriff stepped inside, he noticed the way the younger children looked at each other, their eyes darting nervously toward the back of the house, as if warning one another to stay silent. He followed that trail of silence, down a narrow hall where the boards sagged beneath his weight, to a locked door that reeked faintly of mildew and sickness. The patriarch blocked his path, muttering that it was just a storage room, but the sheriff pushed past, forcing the door open, and there, in the shadows, he found her. The girl sat on a small cot, knees tucked to her chest, her face turned toward the sound of the intrusion, though she could not see. Skin stretched smooth where her eyes should have been, her head tilting as if listening to the stranger's breath. She was thin, almost skeletal, her hair matted with dust, her nightdress torn at the hem. But it wasn't her deformity that made the sheriff stagger back. It was the unmistakable swell of her stomach. She was carrying a child. The room seemed to collapse around him. In that moment, the sheriff knew this was no ordinary case of neglect. This was something the town would never want recorded, something that could rip apart the fragile fabric holding their community together. The question burned in his mind, but he dared not ask it aloud. Who was the father? Later accounts suggest the sheriff didn't even finish his investigation. Some say he left the house pale and shaken, muttering only that the family would handle it. Hers claim he struck a deal with the patriarch, promising silence in exchange for never having to return. Whatever the truth, no official report was ever filed. The courthouse archives contain no record of his visit. What remains are the whispers, echoes of a discovery too monstrous to name, buried in the quiet hills where shame outlived justice. The sheriff may have turned his back, but the town could not forget. Secrets don't stay buried in soil that shallow. The whispers spread faster than wildfire, and soon every church pew, every corner store, every bar stool carried some version of the tale. Some swore the girl had been born of the devil, others whispered she was punishment for the sins of her parents. But there were a few, those who had known the family's history for generations, who understood the truth more clearly. This was not the work of curses or demons. This was blood poisoning itself. The family tree was a circle. Brothers marrying cousins, uncles marrying nieces, each generation folding tighter and tighter until the children born carried the visible scars of collapse. Missing limbs, twisted jaws, faces that never looked quite right, stillborn babies buried quietly behind the barn at night. It was a cycle that fed on desperation, on fear of outsiders, on an obsession with keeping land and property in the blood. And out of that cycle came the eyeless daughter. She was not the first to bear such deformities, but she was the most disturbing, because she lived long enough to be seen. And now she was pregnant. That single fact shook even those who had grown used to tales of deformity, because it raised the one question no one wanted to answer. Had she been forced by someone within her own family? Or, though it was unthinkable, was she carrying the child of another malformed sibling? Neighbors began watching the farmhouse from afar. They claimed to hear muffled cries in the night, to see lanterns burning long past midnight, and sometimes to glimpse the shadow of the eyeless girl herself standing in the window, her swollen stomach outlined against the dim glow of a lamp. Children dared each other to run up to the porch, but none stayed long. They swore they felt something unnatural in the air, as if the house itself exhaled a sickening breath. The family, of course, denied everything. They became more reclusive, sending their children out only under cover of darkness. The patriarch stopped attending church altogether, and while the town grew more curious, no one stepped forward. Because deep down, everyone knew, if you pried too deeply into that house, you might not like what you found. The further you trace this family's history, the more it begins to look less like genealogy and more like a pattern of decay repeating itself. Old court documents, faded, water-damaged, nearly unreadable, hint at scandals long before the eyeless daughter was ever born. In 1872, a charge of indecency leveled against a cousin. In 1889, an unwed daughter sent away to a sanitarium in another state, never to be mentioned again. And in 1903, a suspicious death listed only as complications at birth, though no records survive of who the mother might have been. These fragments, scattered across dusty ledgers, show a family haunted by its own choices. But it was the oral histories, the things people swore only in whispers, that revealed the most. An old woman, nearly 90, remembered her mother forbidding her to play near that farmhouse. She recalled hearing cries echoing from the hills at night, not quite human, not quite animal. A man in his 60s confessed after too much whiskey that he once caught sight of a child from that family with skin so pale it looked translucent, veins like blue rivers under glass. And again, the stories returned to the same image: children hidden away, shielded from view, denied the light of day. The eyeless daughter became the most infamous of them all because she was impossible to ignore. Her pregnancy made her more than a curiosity. It made her a threat. She embodied what everyone feared would happen if the family line continued unchecked, a body that was not just broken, but multiplying. And so the family grew desperate. Some say they tried to marry her off in secret, to invent a story that would cover her condition. Others claim she was locked away even tighter, food and water pushed through the crack beneath her door, her cries muffled until even the neighbors grew silent with dread. The truth of her child, whether it was born, whether it lived or whether it was buried before it took its first breath, remains the darkest silence of all. The records end there, the paper trail vanishes, and what's left is only a hole where the truth should be, but the hole itself is telling. Sometimes what's missing is the loudest testimony of all. It's tempting to believe that stories like this are isolated, the product of one strange family tucked away in the hills. But the deeper you look, the more you realize that what happened in that farmhouse was not an accident. It was part of a larger silence that stretched across America. The rural poor, cut off from medicine, from schools, from the flow of outside bloodlines, created pockets where tragedy repeated itself. And yet what makes this case different is not just the deformity, not just the pregnancy. It's how fiercely the family and the town together worked to erase it. Think about that for a moment. A sheriff who refuses to file a report, a church congregation that lowers its eyes rather than asking questions, neighbors who whisper but never intervene. It wasn't just the family that locked that girl away, it was everyone. The whole community built a coffin of silence around her, as though if they never spoke her name, she might stop existing. But she did exist. That's the part that gnaws at you the longer you sit with it. She breathed. She bled. She carried a child inside her body. She felt hunger and loneliness and fear, and yet she was reduced to nothing more than a rumor, a symbol of shame. And when she vanished from the record, not a single person asked where she had gone. The most chilling detail came from an interview I found buried in an archive from the 1960s. A man whose grandfather had lived next door to the family recalled a single night when his grandfather saw a lantern moving through the woods at 2 a.m. He followed it, quiet as he could, and from the tree line he claimed he saw the patriarch digging with his sons. Something bundled in cloth lay nearby, small and limp, lowered into the earth. Was it the baby? Was it the daughter herself? The witness never knew, but he swore until the day he died that he'd seen a burial that night. 1. No preacher presided over. This is how history rots, not with headlines, but with silences, not with records, but with omissions. And when you begin to piece them together, you realize the silence itself was deliberate. The eyeless daughter may have vanished from the record, but her absence didn't erase the blood that made her. The family endured, its name changing slightly with each census, as though it was trying to shed its own skin. But the deformities continued. By the 1920s, locals spoke of a boy born with a cleft face that never fully closed. In the 1940s, a girl with twisted limbs who could not walk. And in the 1950s, a child so small, so fragile, that neighbors said he looked more like a bird than a human being. Each generation produced reminders that the past was never buried as deeply as the family hoped. The tragedy wasn't just in the children's suffering, it was in the way the family tried to conceal it. They built sheds, barns, and back rooms where cries could be stifled. They homeschooled the younger ones, not out of principle, but to hide the way their faces drew stares. In photographs, they arranged themselves carefully, placing healthy children in front, while the others disappeared from view altogether. Sometimes, an entire child would vanish between census years, their names never spoken again. But what people remembered most were the stories passed down in hushed tones, the legends of the girl with no eyes. By the middle of the 20th century, she had become less a person and more a haunting presence. Children were warned not to wander too close to the old homestead. They were told that if you stared too long at the windows, you might see her standing there still, her empty face pressed to the glass. Some swore they heard her crying in the wind when they walked home at night. And yet, behind the folklore, there was always the memory of something real, something flesh and blood that the community itself had allowed to wither in the dark. The more you trace these fragments, the more you sense the weight of a curse. Not a curse cast by spirits, but by choices, by secrecy, by pride, by fear of outsiders. And the eyeless daughter, though long gone, remained the centerpiece of that curse. She was the wound that never healed, the scar tissue across the family's name, and like all wounds left untreated, it festered. If you've stayed with me this long, you've already walked further into the shadows than most ever dare. And maybe you felt that unease tightening in your chest, the sense that this isn't just a story about one family, but about the things we all bury, the things we all refuse to confront. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Because here's the truth. The people who lived near that farmhouse didn't just witness the curse. In a way, they became part of it. By choosing silence, by looking the other way, they allowed the deformities, the secrecy, the cycles of shame to continue. They didn't just bury the eyeless girl and her unborn child, they buried their own responsibility. And yet, her presence refused to die. Locals reported dreams of a faceless girl walking through their homes. Hunters swore they heard footsteps behind them in the forest, only to turn and see no one. One woman claimed that when she passed the abandoned farmhouse as a girl, she saw a figure in white on the porch. It swayed back and forth as though humming a lullaby. She never forgot it, because even though the figure had no eyes, it seemed to be watching her. Folklore grew like weeds over the grave of truth. Some said the girl's child was born and lived, hidden away until it grew old enough to wander the woods, a shadow no one dared approach. Others whispered that her baby was stillborn, buried under the roots of an oak tree, and that the tree still weeps sap like tears every spring. Nobody knew for certain, because the family said nothing, wrote nothing. Their silence became a wall higher than stone. But silence has cracks. And when you press your ear against that wall, when you listen closely enough, what leaks through is more terrifying than any ghost story. What leaks through is the sound of Gentiles, Iratians living with the consequences of bloodlines that folded in on themselves, and a girl who, even in death, refuses to disappear. By the mid-20th century, the family's name was nearly gone, broken into fragments and scattered across county lines. Some descendants married into new bloodlines, desperate to outrun the shadow of their past. Others stayed behind, clinging to the land as if their very survival depended on it. But no matter how far they ran, or how carefully they changed their names, the old blood lingered. The family curse seeped forward like oil through soil, slow, invisible, impossible to cleanse. A genealogist I spoke with years ago described it perfectly. She said, "It's not the deformities that haunt a family line like this. It's the memory. Even if the blood dilutes, the story doesn't." And she was right. Because in county after county, people still whispered about them. Teachers recalled children with odd features. Neighbors remembered families that kept to themselves. And always, somewhere in the shadows of the tale, was the reminder of the eyeless girl. She became less a person and more a symbol of what happens when secrets rot too long. Some say her image was even used as a warning to children. "Don't stray too far from home," mothers would say. "The eyeless daughter will take you." Imagine growing up with that story in your own bloodline, hearing it not as a folktale, but as something tied to your name. The shame was inescapable. And then there were the darker rumors, the ones that suggested the bloodline never truly broke free, that in some of the descendants, strange births still occurred behind closed doors, babies that never saw a doctor, infants that disappeared before they could be baptized, quiet burials at night, just like the one the neighbor claimed to witness decades earlier. There is no paper record of these, of course, only the whispered accounts of locals who swore they saw something wrong in the faces of children who were never allowed to attend school. This is where the line between history and legend blurs. But remember, legends don't survive without a seed of truth, and every seed in this family tree seemed to sprout from the same poisoned soil. The eyeless daughter may have been swallowed by silence, but her shadow stretched into every generation that followed. The strangest part about researching this family was not what I found, but what I didn't. Archives that should have been filled with names, dates, baptisms, and death certificates were suddenly blank. Pages torn out of church ledgers, gaps in census records where entire households vanished without explanation. It was as though someone, generation after generation, was erasing the family from history in real time. And yet you can never erase everything. Paper may burn, ink may fade, but the land remembers. The farmhouse still stands, though barely. Its roof caved in decades ago, the porch sagging like a mouth without teeth. Step inside and you'll find remnants, children's shoes half buried in dust, a crib with one side broken, the faint smell of mildew mixed with something metallic that lingers in the wood. Locals say no one dares stay the night there. They hear whispers in the walls. They hear footsteps upstairs when the house is empty. One man claimed he once picked up a photograph from the debris, a faded family portrait, stiffly posed. Everyone in the picture had their eyes scratched out. Not drawn over, not faded from time, scratched with something sharp, gouged into the paper. He swore he felt sick holding it, as though the image itself was poisoned. When he tried to bring it home, he said his truck broke down on the road and he abandoned the photo right there in the dirt. All these stories circle back to the same haunting presence, the eyeless daughter. Even though she should have been forgotten, she refuses to vanish. Her name, her face, her child, all erased by her family, yet preserved in rumor, in nightmare, in the way people still lower their voices when speaking of that house. What unsettles me most is this. In every record I dug through, in every testimony I found, nobody ever dared say her name, not once. It's as if denying her that simple human recognition was the final act of burial. She was not only hidden in life and erased in death, she was denied even the dignity of being remembered. And yet somehow, here she is, staring back at us through the silence. The further I traced her story, the more I realized this was never about a single child born wrong. It was about the weight of silence, and how silence can deform an entire community just as surely as blood can deform a body. Every generation that refused to speak, every neighbor who looked the other way, every sheriff who closed his book instead of writing the report, all of them became complicit. The eyeless daughter was not just their shame, she was their creation. Some researchers of Appalachian folklore suggest that families like this were deliberately forgotten, pushed out of the narrative of American progress. Their suffering didn't fit the story of grit and triumph that the country wanted to tell. And so when a child was born with no eyes, or when that same child carried another life inside her, the collective instinct was to bury it, to deny it ever happened, not because they didn't see, but because they saw too clearly and couldn't live with what it meant. Imagine being her. A life confined to a locked room, a body marked by bloodlines that twisted inward, a womb carrying a secret no one dared acknowledge, and then disappearing. No grave, no stone, no date, nothing but whispers that echo for more than a century. There's a cruelty in that kind of erasure more profound than any physical suffering. To suffer is human. To be denied recognition of that suffering is monstrous, and yet some say the curse of the eyeless daughter endures not in the land, but in the mind. Descendants who left the mountains still report strange dreams, visions of a faceless woman standing at the foot of their bed, silently rocking as though cradling a child. Some wake with nosebleeds. Some claim they hear lullabies in a language they don't recognize. Rational people scoff, call it coincidence, call it folklore, but others insist it is memory, an ancestral memory too heavy to fade, low, eking forward through bloodlines that tried to escape but never truly could. Perhaps that is her revenge, not to haunt the farmhouse, but to haunt the people who tried to bury her. We began with a mystery. A girl born without eyes, hidden in a farmhouse, carrying a child no one wanted to acknowledge, and we end not with answers, but with silence. The kind of silence that stains history darker than any confession ever could, because in the end, it doesn't matter whether the child survived, or whether the girl herself was buried beneath an oak tree, or abandoned in the woods, or erased from every ledger. What matters is that she was real, she existed, and a community decided that was too much to bear. That's why the story lingers like a shadow, not because of ghosts, but because of guilt. Every missing record, every scratched-out name, every family photograph with empty eyes. These are not accidents. They are deliberate acts of forgetting. And yet, in their attempts to erase her, they ensured she would never truly disappear. The eyeless daughter became eternal, a wound festering beneath layers of denial, her absence louder than any presence. When you strip away the superstition, what's left is even darker. This wasn't a curse, it wasn't the devil's work. It was human choice. It was men and women deciding to marry within their own blood, deciding to hide their mistakes, deciding to bury their children rather than admit their shame. The horror is not supernatural. The horror is that people are capable of this, and capable of agreeing, silently, to pretend it never happened. And that's why you can still feel it. Walk near that farmhouse today, and you'll sense it in the air. Not a ghost, but the weight of all those lives denied. A century of silence pressing down on the earth. A story no one wanted told, yet one that refuses to stay buried. Remember this. History doesn't always live in the books we're given. Sometimes it hides in whispers, in locked rooms, in families that vanish between census lines. Sometimes it stares back at us from the dark, faceless but undeniable. And once you've seen it, once you've heard her story, you can never unsee her. The eyeless daughter will follow you, not in the shadows, not in your sleep, but in the quiet knowledge of what people are capable of hiding and what they are capable of doing to their own blood.